Okay, so today we are picking up where we left off last time. This is picking up with the Roman Republic, and we'll be discussing today the turmoil at the end of the Roman Republic, its early history, the turmoil that history produces, and its transition into an imperial state, that is a state with an emperor, as opposed to a republic. Before I begin, are there any questions regarding the foundations and formations of Rome as we discussed last time? Okay, great. Obviously awesome as a lecturer. Okay, so Rome, during the Republic, was created as the city we've discussed so far. And this is the basic layout of the city as it developed. There are different elements around it. You'll notice the core of the city is surrounded by a wall, and then there are fields outside. Rome, like many cities of this time period, was based around the foundation of 7 hills, with the central place, in this case the Forum, lower down. You can see the different hills that it was centered around. What's extremely important to recognize about the foundation of Rome is that it was developed both as an urban center and with an agricultural base around it. The urban center is that part which is walled off here. Now, the most important thing to remember about Rome is that the Forum, right here in the center of it, was the heart and soul and mind of the Republic. It was here in the Forum where the Senate was, where trials were held in the Constinium and the Rubura, and where the House of the Vestal Virgins was. Now, who knows what the Vestal Virgins were? Does anybody? If you remember back to our discussion of Greek gods and goddesses, you'll remember that Hestia was the goddess of the fire, of the hearth and the home. Well, in Greek mythology, she was Hestia. In Roman mythology, she was Vesta. And the priestesses who tended that fire to make sure the fire never went out, so that the city would never be without a flame, a sacred flame as it developed later. Those were known as the Vestal Virgins for reasons that one would guess is kind of obvious about the nature of their vows when they took it. And so they were central part of this Forum zone. Just outside the Forum zone, over here, indeed outside the wall of the city, was the voting enclosure. Now remember, I mentioned how the voting was done. There were 2 houses that did elections. One was the tribal elections, one was the centurion elections, and these 2 were both held out here. There have been archaeological excavations that are fascinating, and I can talk about that forever, but I won't. This is also the Circus Maximus of that time. Circus Maximus was a big sporting arena where people would have chariot races. We always think of gladiatorial combats when we think of Rome, and often that's the case. It was certainly very popular, particularly in the imperial period. But during the Republic and even afterwards, the most popular form of sport were chariot races, where you get in this giant Circus Maximus, that means big circle, and they do races all around in the equivalent of 90% NASCAR, 10% demolition derby of the time period. So, that was the city of Rome as it was founded. Come on. And here again is the layout of how the Republic worked with the tribal assembly and the centuriate assembly. Tribal assembly based on where you lived, centuriate assembly based on what your income was. All people equally represented in theory, but with the tribal assembly districted in a manner that makes the rich people have more votes, and the centuriate assembly quite literally divided so that there is 100 votes for the richest people and 92 votes for the poorest people. Blah. There are also all these official offices and the Senate. Senate deals with foreign affairs, but has incredible influence due to its prestige. So they often debated city affairs as well. That's the basic layout of republic government. Now, as I said before, from early on there was a struggle between the elites in the society, the patricians, wealthy aristocrats from leading families, and everybody else, or the plebeians. Those are the working class. Those are not rich landowners, but poor small farmers, people who are doing the work in the city, anybody who is not a slave, but also not one of these elite ruling families. And this was a struggle that went on from the beginning and there was a bit of a solution to that in the previous slide, in the way that eventually all public offices were opened up to anyone who was a Roman citizen. So I went into all of that, but we're going to start today with a bit of an issue. One of the problems early Rome came across. And this is Rome when it was just a city. Oh, it was a city with great importance in the area that had already somewhat conquered some of the Latin states around it. The Sabines, the Samnites, things like that. But it was not Rome as we think of it. It was a city-state that had expanded into being a little bit larger of a city-state, or at least of a small state. But in 386 BC, for a variety of reasons that we don't exactly know, though perhaps in next class I'll have a chance to give you some hypotheses about that, there was a mass of people who the Greeks referred to as the Keltoi, and the Romans referred to as the Gauls, who crossed the Alps from the west, we believe, and attacked it. And they took the Po Valley, which is where the Etruscans had lived. They captured it, and they dwelt there. And they occupied it until 186 BC, which we'll get into at a different time. And as they came down, they charged out of the north, this huge barbarian horde, and they had a political meeting with some of Rome's diplomats, with the consul, who went out, and 7 of the great patrician families came forward and started discussing things with a man named Brennus, who was the chief of their chieftains, right? He was the sort of considered their king, as it were. And they started discussing back and forth different things, and things got heated very quickly. For one thing, the Gauls, the Celts, as we have come to call them these days, were very, shall we say, fiery, passionate people who were very quick to take offense. So you can imagine this sort of discussion between these people who thought of themselves as the children of Romulus, the descendants of Mars, and the sophisticated urbanites of the central Mediterranean, talking to a bunch of people who took the slightest insult gravely. The discussions didn't go well. And then the Romans stabbed one of the Keltoi chieftains in the chest with a spear, killing him. Well, that had the opposite effect of going to talk and have a peace treaty with these people, especially since the Romans were not on good terms with the Etruscans beforehand, so that we would wonder why they would do this. Doesn't matter. The point is, at the long and the short of it, according to Livy, they killed one of the chieftains and then ran the heck away, and that launched the Gauls down into the Italian peninsula. Before that, they had been in what's called Cisalpine Gaul. That's a very northern part of what is now Italy, along the Po Valley, where places like those northern Venetian states are. Now they went charging south. And at the Battle of Allia, the Roman legions went out and were, now mind you, these were the Roman legions before the Marian reforms, so they weren't the legions that we think of as the empire. But still, these were a large group of people set out in hoplite tradition, just like the Greeks, and with the cavalry, their well-trained, well-armed cavalry, up on a hill behind them. Well, the Celts looked at this and said, we're not going to go down and charge in and meet that legion one-to-one. They just went around the legion and slammed into the cavalry up on the top of the hill with wild abandon, destroyed the cavalry, and then went down and destroyed the infantry in the valley, at the Battle of Allia, or Allia, as it's sometimes called. And these mass of people raided as far south as Rome. They sacked part of the city, and according to some accounts were driven off, but according to other accounts, were somewhat bought off by the consul. They had a large pallet of gold, and they had to have, the Romans were going to give a tribute of a certain amount of gold in order to buy off the Celts. And the Celts put a bunch of weights on one side of the scale, and the Romans objected that the weights were not fair. They weren't equal weights. And so they had piled all this gold up, and they were saying, this is not the right amount of gold. You look at all this gold we're giving, your weights are unjust. At which point, Brennus took his sword and pushed down on the other side of the scale and said what the quote that can be translated as, to the victors goes the spoils. In other words, you don't have a chance. We're being nice by letting you buy your way out of this. We own the rest of your city. Give us the money, or we're going to sack the rest of Rome. And Rome capitulated. Now, I bring up the Celtic migrations. We'll talk about those in more detail later. But effectively, it didn't just stop there. By 360 BCE, the Celts continued on, or at least a large portion of them. Some of them settled up in the Po Valley, in what is then known as Cisalpine Gaul. Others continued on into the Danube, into the Transylvanian wooded areas, into Illyria, and etc. by 360 BCE. And others moved even further east to Anatolia, into central Anatolia, where you can still see a population of certain people from the central highlands of Turkey who look physically different to many of the others around there. Some people say that they are the descendants of the Gauls. The book, the Galatians in the Bible, for those of you who are familiar with it, was written about those people, and they did carry the name Galatian for a very long time. Whether or not that actually means they were Gauls is another story altogether. In any case, in 279 BCE, they had a second large-scale movement and invaded Greece and sacked the Temple of Delphi, which was one of the great oracles of Greece. So this group of people went charging on out and made a huge impact. Why do I bring all of this up? Well, first of all, because it's Western civilization and it's a Western Civ thing, but also because they had an incredible impact on Rome. They This migration was said to have happened by the Romans, said because the Etruscans traded too greedily. They gave too much wine to these people that inspired them to come charging down. And that the Gallic people had an unstable political system. Their politics were all unstable and tumultuous. So here they were, the Etruscans, through their greed, were throwing money at them. This unstable system, it caused all sorts of internal turmoil up amongst the Gauls, and that caused them to come charging down. I bring that up because that created a fear of unstable politics in other countries and regions that persisted in Rome throughout its entire history. It was repeatedly used to justify interventions in the affairs of other cultures as a precautionary step to provide stability, because we know what happens if there isn't stability in an area. Remember the Gauls. And this was used as a key political device for the next few hundred years. It also changed much of the nature of Roman society when it came to their military. Now, the Romans were always a bit of a martial people, but here they created it helped inspire a much more militarized society. And so, one of the reasons Rome became the military might that it did was because of the fear that this early event put into them. And you may or may not be able to think of historic events in even our own society that are often called upon and often turned back to as a sign of fear and used politically to get different ends. So, the first transformation that occurred was the Roman armies. And it transformed at this period, and it was a citizens' army, much like the Greeks before it. It was an army made up of, first and foremost, farmers and citizens, later volunteers who would work, who gave up their lands, whatever, and could be in the Roman army. You had to be a citizen to be in the Roman army, particularly at the early parts. There were auxiliaries later when it was an empire. They came from other locations, but to be in the army itself, you had to be a citizen of Rome. And it created the legion system. Now, a legion is about 4,000 men, more or less. It is not a hard figure. That is 40 companies of 100 men each. Each company called a century, that means 100, each led by a centurion, from which we get the name. Sort of half sergeant, half captain. And they had iron discipline. They focused on discipline, and they trained constantly, and eventually became a professional army. That is to say, that people would join the army and get paid to be soldiers. And that will come into play with the development of Rome in a bit. Now, as Rome continued to grow, it gained different characteristics. For one thing, based on its origins, the Republic remains skeptical of a monarch. Do not forget, Rome was formed, as we discussed last week, based on its revolt against the Etruscan king Tarquin, and they created a senate and a republic in response to that. They did not trust monarchies. They did not trust the individual. It was a traditional system. It was a society that wasn't just culturally traditional in saying that they turned back to the old ways, but it was intentionally designed to keep tradition in place. So for example, that whole system by which the older patrician families have more power is done because that is the way it is done, because it is bowing their heads to the fact that these patricians existed before, and so should continue to exist. They do things in the ways of their father. It was based on a loyalty to family above and beyond all else. One's family was the core and center of everything. And unlike the Republican ideals that dominated their governance, a family was a dictatorship under the rule of the pater familias, that is, the head of the family, the father of the family, who had the power of life and death over anyone in their household. Rome also began to become expansionist. It began to grow. It began to grow in part out of a fear of unstable actions around them, and in part out of a desire to have more power and more control. But initially, and key about the Republic was that they were often gracious conquerors. They would conquer an area and then give them a lot of power and autonomy. Indeed, the Latin areas were very quickly annexed into Rome, so that citizens of areas outside of the city of Rome soon became Roman citizens as well. And thus the open citizenship, that it was not just, as Sparta was, closed to only Spartans, but open as areas were conquered and absorbed into the Republic. So, as time went forward, Rome came to dominate the entirety of the Italian peninsula in what is referred to as the Italian Wars. You can see how it sort of evolved here. 290 they took Umbria, 280 they took Etruria, in 290 they had taken Samnium, etc. All on down, they gradually began to conquer the Italian peninsula. This is the Po Valley up here, by the way, up in that area. So this is all Cisalpine Gaul. They were generous to the conquered, and they had a concept of divide and rule. They didn't form the same peace treaty with any two nations because of two elements. One, they knew that the grievances of any two nations would be different. So they dealt with each area, each problem individually, but also because that gave less ground for conquered people to be able to find unity when fighting Rome. After all, if one set of people actually really wanted increased expenditure of land grants, and another set of people wanted more ships, it's not going to be easy to find, they don't have a natural coalition to go together. And that makes them easier to rule, easier to negotiate problems with. And Rome, in early Rome, was very generous in those elements. Now, during this time, it also started to defeat Greek colonies who it came up against. And this was part of its politically just war concept. Now, Rome believed that a war had to be just. So they had to justify whatever war they went on into. And they justified the wars against the Greek colonies because they had noted that the Greek colonies had were supplying their enemies, here, there, and the other place. And so the Greek colonies supported some of their enemies, so the Romans said, all right, well, obviously we have to go attack the Greeks now because they were supporting people against us and we can't let that happen again. Eventually, this logic brought them into conflict with Carthage, because Carthage supported some of the Greek colonies as well. And if you remember, Carthage is descended of what culture? Yeah. Phoenicians, exactly. They have been thrown out of Phoenicia by the Persians. Carthage becomes their central colony, and they are now known as the Puni, which means purple people. And thus begins the Punic Wars. There were 3 Punic Wars of Rome against Carthage. And this is a picture of Carthage. And they created a series of significant battles that defined early Rome and created problems for it later. Now, the First Punic War began with the dispute of the Greeks and Carthaginians over territories, who rules what. And Rome invaded part of Sicily held by Carthage. And this was a total mismatch of power. If you remember, Carthage at this time is the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean, possibly in the Mediterranean as a whole, if you're excluding Persia as a state there, because they didn't have major naval force. So they dominate the Mediterranean as a sea force, and really they have colonies and trading and impact all around the Western Mediterranean. It has the preeminent navy of the period. And the Romans had no navy to speak of. But in classic Roman style, what they did was they looked at Carthaginian ships and copied them, and altered them a little to match their needs, and then started to build. They devoted a huge portion of their economy simply to building a navy. And knowing that they had to train, they would have legionnaires on the coast, sitting on logs, practicing rowing together before the ships were ever even finished. So from day one, they began training to build an army, and they put their whole economy into producing a professional navy. Now, everyone was surprised when Rome won that war, because they were totally mismatched. But they had a dedication to warfare. So, to everyone's surprise, they threw Carthage off of Sicily. So, in other words, they defeated the Carthaginians, they took Sicily, and they forced Carthage to pay a large tribute to Rome. And this led to unhappiness on everybody's side, but particularly on the Carthaginians' side, and led to the Second Punic War, sometime later. This is the one with Hannibal and the elephants. Anybody know the story of Hannibal and the elephants? No? Oh, guys. I'm upset with your history teachers, not with you guys. Okay. Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, decided to invade Italy. And he did this by going across to the Iberian Peninsula, unloading a vast number of troops, including elephants, giant war elephants, which he then took along the south of Gaul, along the south of France, and across the Alps, and invaded down across the Alps into the Italian peninsula. Now, actually, makes a fantastic image, can't you see, the idea of giant elephants. These are African elephants, to remember. Giant elephants on the battlefield, things of which most Romans had never seen. A horrifying concept, and actually a pretty good war machine. Of course, most of those elephants didn't actually make it, right? They mostly died. There were only a couple of elephants on the battlefield. But an elephant on the battlefield is like a tank, where there's never been a tank before. It is a terrifying creature. And in this battle, Carthage was really winning the war tremendously. But Rome showed its other major ability, not just to adapt and learn from other cultures, but it was tenacious. When it tried to fight the better trained, larger Carthaginian army on the Italian peninsula and started losing, they realized they can't go head-to-head against Hannibal. So they started a guerrilla warfare and started doing hit-and-run tactics against the Carthaginians. And eventually they won. Basically through a war of attrition. Because after all, if you have an invading army, you can't just keep it out in the field for years and years and years in enemy territory. We've all seen the problems of that you could say, from Vietnam onwards, Afghanistan, Iraq. There have been issues of being able to maintain an occupying force, especially if you haven't actually won the territory, as was the case with Carthage. So Rome won, and it stripped Carthage of all of its foreign holdings and took direct control of those foreign holdings in the Iberian Peninsula. So Rome suddenly grows to include all the stuff in the south of Spain and Portugal. And they begin putting out colonies of their own and rapidly expanding. Now this will come back to haunt them in a moment. Now during this time period, the Iberians and the Celta-Iberians were still independent. So that is, the north and west of the country was independent. It was the south and east that was taken over. And they have ended up rebelling and having a war in a later time period, but that's a side point. Rome's conquest of Iberia resulted in a huge amount of food being available for Rome now, because it was a breadbasket. It was great for growing things. And that, some say, was the beginnings of the undermining of Roman economy. Because if you have a society based on farming and tradition of farming, and suddenly you have this huge source of farming coming into the city from outside, able to be shipped at a lower cost because it's being shipped as opposed to brought across land, that's going to have problems with the economy. It also increased the amount of traffic along southern Gaul. And that will lead to other issues. So at about this time, Rome invaded the Po Valley because they were afraid of the Celts. And they feared the Celts on its northern borders, so they invaded there while they're fighting the Celta-Iberians and the Celts over in Spain, taking two wars on at the same time. Pretty major investment. Two wars, two different fronts. And then came along the Third Punic War in 149 146 BC. Now, I could go on forever about that, but Carthage had become a thorn in Rome's side and was used constantly as a political tool, particularly by a man named Cato the Elder, who ended every speech in the Senate that he gave with Carthago delende est, which is Carthage must be destroyed. We talk about hammering on. Can you imagine? We're talking about the amounts of money that need to be spent on building the new aqueduct across town. But at the end of the day, Carthage must be destroyed. destroy. Well, eventually, that's what happened. Rome went to war against Carthage again, this time invading the city. But unlike before, they totally sacked Carthage. Its entire population was either killed or taken and sold into slavery. The whole population of the city and the ground around the city, the fields around the city, and the city itself was sowed with salt. That is to say, they took salt and plowed it into the ground to make it sterile, so nothing could grow there. When they said they were going to destroy Carthage, they utterly destroyed Carthage. Took their people, wiped them out, destroyed the city that nothing might ever live there again. And that left Rome as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. And pretty much, they also pretty much dominated the countries of Greece and Egypt, with whom they formed very strong ties. And basically, those two countries, if you remember, both sort of Greek in nature now anyways, became vassal states. They became states who owed allegiance to Rome. They sort of gave tribute to Rome. So, if you see the area in red, that is Rome before the Punic Wars. If you see the areas in dark yellow, that is Rome after the Punic Wars. And if you see the area in lighter yellow, that is Rome by the end of 44 BCE. I bring that date up because that ties into a later element. Now, all of this creates power in Rome, but it also creates social strife. In 140 BCE, Rome had become a territorial army and a territorial empire and dominated the Mediterranean. And that expansion brought huge amounts of new wealth into the city, for some. That wealth created economic disparity because the rich got richer and then would do things like buy property from the poor at a low price and sell it at a high price, or farm it, and leaving a larger and larger class of unworking, unsustainable poor. The latifundia, the patricians, started gaining larger and larger estates, either by buying the properties of people around them, or by gaining access to public lands through land grants in the Senate, well, not in the Senate, but in the Republic, because they're controlling the votes. So they're being given land that is public land and allowed to farm it, giving them greater and greater control and, well, a hegemonistic monopoly, if you were. That is to say, a handful of people controlling more and more of the countryside and more of the wealth, which ended up creating more and more laborers and slaves, debt slaves as well as slaves from conquered countries. And also led to something else, which was the rise of Greco-Roman civilization. Those wars with Greece ended up with a number of Greek slaves being taken. And those Greek slaves were brought in, often to the homes of individuals, of patricians, and of the educated, sometimes to educate the children. And that led to Horace, Roman poet of 65 BCE, saying, captive Greece took her captor captive, meaning that Greek culture began to grow and influence in Roman culture, which the old traditionalists, of course, saw as a big problem. And if you remember, Rome is a society based on tradition. It created a conflict of old values, those of farming and population and the city-state first, versus new ideas, Greek ideas and values, ideas more of a democratic nature, ideas of individualism and arete over the good of the polis. Art and architecture was heavily influenced by the Greeks, and Greek history began to become incorporated into Roman history. Greek origins, many of the Roman origin stories, such as the tale of Aeneas and the founding of Rome, were tied into things like the conquest of Troy. Now, as Rome expanded, it gained more and more slaves. And slaves began to take over whole portions of the economy. There were occupations that were solely run by slaves. Most servants, household servants, were considered slaves. Many field workers became slaves. They had these lower jobs, agriculture and mining for the most part, and things like digging out slop. But they also had some high status jobs, such as tutors, as I just discussed, and household workers and the like. And this led to a series of things called the social wars in Rome between 135 and 71 BCE, which are three major slave revolts which needed to be put. And the last of them was the one known, sometimes called the Spartacan revolt. Are you going to launch? God, this takes too long. It says it's supposed. Oh, and now it's speaking in my ear. Never mind. It was a joke. I am Spartacus, right? If you've seen the old movie or the new television show about the Spartacan revolt, the slave revolt, where the gladiators rose up and basically caused havoc across the Italian peninsula as they grew larger and larger in numbers, and the legions couldn't take them on until they were finally crushed when Caesar and Cassius, we'll get to in a moment, took over. This is that time period. This is that revolt, the last of them, which ended with all of the gladiators being crucified down the entire length of the road to Rome. So that didn't end too well. Well, at least for the gladiators. But beyond the slave revolt, it led to other problems and economic disparity in the classes that existed. First of all, there are a bunch of slaves, so people are not being paid, so there's lack of money going into the system. And there's all these people without farms now, and all these people unemployed. So this creates a greater economic disparity. You have an increase in landless laborers, but you also get a series, something else occurring because of the foreign wars. Now, the foreign wars created a class of veterans who needed a means of support. You have a whole bunch of unemployed veterans coming back from the war, and veterans who are loyal to, as it turns out eventually, not the Republic as a whole, as much as the person they see as their patron, the general of that Republic. And that leads to what becomes known as the twilight of the Republic. I thought I had been here on Marius' revolt, but that's okay. It begins what is called with the Marius reforms, which starts by reforming the army and turning it into a fully professional army. And then moves forward and becomes something else. But actually, sorry, I'm jumping in time. Sorry, that's right. First we'll deal with the Gracchi brothers, the brothers of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And they began their political career through a focus on redistributing the land. Now remember that a lot of the land that had been public land was being farmed out to the rich patricians. Well, the Gracchi brothers said, well, we have all these poor people in the city who don't have a means of support. We should take the lands away from the patricians and redistribute them amongst the poor of the society. Well, to some, this was seen as a way of violating mos meaorum, which is the parental element of the society, and pietas. That is to say, individuals thought that Tiberius, to begin with, oops, where's all this coming from? That Tiberius was trying to get more clients and more political power. So that began as an issue. And that led to a conflict between the optimates and the populares. Do we remember that from before? The optimates are the people who say they are the optimum, the elites of society, and the populares were the ones in favor of the popular vote. Well, the optimates find real problems with Gracchi, the elder Gracchi, and so they kill him and 300 of his closest supporters. Now these are the people who are supposed to be holding up traditional values. That is the first case in all of the several hundred years of Rome that had happened so far of political violence occurring, and it occurred on a grand scale. Well, a few years later, his brother takes over. His brother runs for the office of tribune, and he starts trying to reintroduce this, but he does it in a more clever way. He creates bigger, broader alliances. He comes up all the rest. So the optimists respond in a little different manner this time. They killed him and 2,000 of his political supporters. And that then leads to the beginning of conflicts for Rome. It is the beginnings, the seeds of what will become known as the Civil War. And somehow or another, I managed to launch the wrong slideshow. So we'll keep talking here because you don't really need to see it. It is online as far as the stuff I handed out. I'll make sure I print that out as well. But what ends up happening next is the Marian reforms, as I mentioned. That leads to Marius gaining a great deal of power and doing what the Gracchi brothers had to do, which is he starts talking about giving the land away to his soldiers. He was a great general. He was a very successful general. And so he goes around and starts redistributing lands to the soldiers. Thus, they all become his clients. This solidifies some elements of the populares under his side, but it leads the optimates against him, and eventually leads to an individual named Sulla rising in power as well. Well, Marius was consul and extremely powerful. Sulla is given a large army to go off on this very prestigious battle. Marius doesn't like this too much, because he thinks he should use it. After all, he has the best military history. And besides, Sulla going out and getting people will make an army that is loyal to Sulla, in the same way that Marius came in and gave an army loyal to Marius. Well, long story short, Sulla comes back with his army. There's conflict between Marius and Sulla. Marius dies of natural causes, but as conflict grows, Sulla marches his army into Rome and declares martial law effectively. And he passes a law that says that Marius, who actually is dead at this time, or anyone who is one of his followers, can be killed for no reason whatsoever in the streets of Rome, and their land taken by the person who kills them. Now, as you can imagine, this leads to a large-scale slaughter back and forth. In part, people slaughtering one another because they have old grievances. In part, you can imagine if you want the land, you just, there's some land I want. You're a supporter of Marius. What? Huh? Killed off. And that then leads to the conflict I'll be discussing in just a second when I switch over. It sets the stage for what becomes the civil wars of Rome. Now hold on just a sec as I launch another program.